Hey there, welcome home. I'm Joe, and no matter where you're listening from tonight, I'm really happy you found your way here. This little corner of the internet was made for nights exactly like this. When your mind is tired, your body is tired, but sleep still feels just out of reach. So let's slow everything down together. Just a few ads in the first 10 minutes, then completely uninterrupted for the rest of the night. If this becomes your bedtime home, I'd love your support with a subscribe and a like. Now make yourself comfortable, and let's begin. I never planned on becoming a park ranger. It sort of found me, the way some jobs do when you're 26 and tired of sitting in an office watching the clock crawl toward 5. My uncle worked the Forestry Service up in the Cascades for most of his life, and after he passed, I guess I wanted a piece of whatever it was that made him love those mountains so much. So I applied, got lucky, and by the following spring, I was stationed at a place I'll just call Hollow Pine, because the real name still makes my stomach turn a little. Hollow Pine wasn't a big park, nothing famous. You wouldn't find it on a postcard or a travel blog. It was mostly locals who came through, a few campers in the summer, the occasional hiker who wanted somewhere quiet. And it was quiet. That was the first thing I noticed when I got there. Not peaceful quiet exactly. More like the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for you to notice it. The guy who trained me was named Russ. He was older, maybe 50s, with a gray beard and hands like tree bark. Good man, patient. He showed me the trails, the ranger station, the radio setup, all the usual stuff. But on my second week, when we were driving the service road out past the northern ridge, he said something that stuck with me for a long time after. He slowed the truck near a fork in the road, where an old path branched off into thicker trees, and he pointed at it without really looking at it. "We don't go up there," he said. "Not you, not me, not anybody. If a hiker asks about it, tell them it's closed for erosion. If they push, tell them it's closed because a kid got hurt years back. Whatever gets them to turn around." I asked him what was actually up there. Seemed like a fair question. He was quiet for a second. Then he just said, "Nothing you wanted to meet." Now, I want to be honest with you. At the time, I thought it was one of those things older rangers do to mess with the new guy. Every job has its ghost stories. The night shift at a gas station, the basement of an old hospital, whatever. I figured Russ was having some fun at my expense, and I let it go. I even laughed about it later. I don't laugh about it anymore. The first month went by without anything strange. I settled into the rhythm of the place. Wake up before the sun, check the trails, log the visitors, refill the water stations, help the odd camper who couldn't figure out their propane stove. It was honest work, and I liked it. I liked the smell of the pines in the morning and the way the fog sat low in the valleys, like a blanket someone forgot to fold. But around week 5, I started noticing little things. Small stuff, easy to explain away. I'd find footprints on trails that were supposed to be empty. Not unusual on its own, except these prints always went one direction, deeper into the woods, never coming back out. I told myself people just took different routes home. It happens. Then there was the counting. Every evening I logged how many cars were in the lot and how many I'd checked out by nightfall. Most days the numbers matched. But maybe once a week they wouldn't. One extra car, nobody in it, no camping permit, no note. I'd wait around, sometimes for an hour, and eventually I'd just log it as a late departure and head home. The car would always be gone by morning. I mentioned it to Russ once. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me it was nothing. He just looked at me for a long moment and asked, "Real careful." "Which lot?" I told him the north lot near the ridge. He nodded slowly like I'd confirmed something he already suspected, and he said, "Keep your logs. Every day. Don't skip one. And if you ever see somebody standing at the edge of the north tree line, just watching you, don't wave back." I asked him what he meant by that. He got in his truck and drove off without answering. That was the night I started paying real attention. And that was the night, though I didn't know it yet, that Hollow Pine started paying attention to me. The first time I saw him, I almost didn't. That's the strange part. Looking back, I think that was the whole point. It was a Tuesday, late September, and the tourist season had already thinned out to nothing. I was doing my evening walk along the Eastern Loop, a flat, easy trail that circled back toward the station. The light was doing that thing it does in autumn, where everything turns gold and heavy, like the whole forest had been dipped in honey. Remember feeling good, calm. I had my flashlight clipped to my belt, my radio on my shoulder, and I was humming some song I couldn't get out of my head. And then, without any reason I could point to, I stopped humming. I don't know how to explain it except that the forest changed. Not in any way you could see. The trees were the same, the light was the same, but the feeling of the place shifted, like walking into a room where two people had just been arguing. That heaviness in the air, that sense that something had happened here a second before you arrived, and now it was pretending it hadn't. I looked toward the north tree line out past a stretch of open meadow, and there was a man standing there. He was maybe 200 feet away, right at the edge where the grass gave up and the trees took over. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, facing me. He wore what looked like an old ranger uniform, the dull green kind, but faded and wrong somehow, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I couldn't make out his face at that distance, just the shape of him. Tall, still, too still. Now, my first instinct was completely normal. I figured it was a hiker, or maybe a retired ranger visiting the old grounds. People do that. So I lifted my hand to wave, and then Russ's voice came back to me. "If you ever see somebody standing at the edge of the north tree line just watching you, don't wave back." I stopped with my hand halfway up. I felt stupid doing it, honestly. But something about the way the guy was standing made the hair on my arms stand up, and I lowered my hand slow, like I didn't want him to notice I'd almost done it. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out. He just watched. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably only a few seconds, and then, feeling ridiculous but not quite able to stop myself, I turned and started walking back toward the station. Not running, just walking, at a normal pace, telling myself there was nothing to run from. But here's the thing that I still think about at night. About halfway back, I glanced over my shoulder to check. He was closer, not walking closer. I would have seen that. The meadow was wide open, flat as a table, nowhere to hide. But he'd gone from the far tree line to maybe halfway across the grass, and he was still standing perfectly still facing me like he'd been placed there. Like someone had picked him up and set him down 100 feet nearer while I wasn't looking. I didn't check again. I walked faster. I got to the station, went inside, locked the door, and I stood at the window with the lights off, watching that meadow until it was too dark to see anything at all. He never crossed the last stretch. He never came to the station. But I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, when I forced myself to walk back out to that meadow in the daylight, there were footprints in the soft dirt near the tree line. Deep ones. The kind you'd leave if you stood in one spot for a long, long time, shifting your weight, waiting. They led back into the woods, north, and of course they never came out. I told Russ everything the next day. I expected him to be spooked, or at least serious. Instead, he just got quiet. And after a while, he asked me one question that I'll never forget. Did you count them? I didn't understand. I asked what he meant. In your log, he said, when you counted the visitors that night, did you count him as a person? I thought about it, and I realized, with a cold feeling spreading through my chest, that I had. I'd been so rattled that when I filled out my evening log out of pure habit, I'd written that I'd seen one unidentified individual near the North Ridge. I'd counted him. Russ closed his eyes like I'd told him someone had died. That's how it starts, he said. You have to stop counting him. The second you write him down, the second you treat him like he's one of the people you're supposed to watch over, he becomes your responsibility. And he knows it. He's been waiting a long time for somebody to take him on. I asked Russ what he was talking about, who the man was, what any of this meant. And Russ, for the first time since I'd met him, looked genuinely afraid. There used to be a ranger here, he said, before my time, long before. They say he went up the North Path one night looking for a lost hiker, and he never came back. But the strange thing is, people kept seeing him for years after. Always at dusk, always watching, and every ranger who counted him, who acknowledged him, who treated him like he was still one of us. He stopped. I asked what happened to them. Russ looked out the window toward the North Ridge, and he said, very quietly, they went up the path, every single one of them, eventually, to go find him. I'd like to tell you I did the smart thing after that conversation. I'd like to tell you I put in for a transfer, packed up my truck, and left Hollow Pine in the rearview mirror. But the truth is more embarrassing than that. I didn't leave because part of me still didn't fully believe it. And another part of me, the part I'm not proud of, was curious. Russ made me promise something before he went home that day. He grabbed my shoulder, looked me dead in the eye, and said, from now on, you don't count him. If you see him, you look away. You do not write him down. You do not speak to him. You do not follow him. And whatever you do, you never, ever let him get you to say his name. I asked how I could say his name if I didn't even know it. Russ said, you will. That's the part that gets everybody. He'll make sure you learn it. For about a week, I did everything right. I saw him twice more, both times at dusk, both times at the north tree line. And both times I did exactly what Russ told me. I looked away. I kept walking. I didn't log him. It felt like ignoring a person standing at your door knocking to be let in, and every instinct in my body screamed that it was rude, that I should acknowledge him, that a good ranger doesn't just turn his back on someone in his park. But I held firm, and I noticed something. On the days I didn't count him, he stayed at the tree line. He didn't get closer. It was like Russ said. He needed to be acknowledged. Without that, he was stuck out there in the meadow, watching, powerless. I started to think maybe I had it handled. Then the radio started. It was a Thursday night, well after dark, and I was alone at the station finishing up my paperwork. The radio on the desk crackled, which wasn't unusual on its own. We got interference sometimes from weather or from other stations bleeding over, but this wasn't static. It was a voice, faint, distant, buried under the crackle, like someone calling from the bottom of a well. Ranger station, do you copy? I've got a lost hiker on the North Path, requesting backup. My blood went cold, because that's a real call. That's the kind of call I'm trained to answer. Every part of my job, every instinct they drilled into me said, pick up the radio and respond. Someone's in trouble. Someone needs help. I reached for it. My hand was actually on it. And then I stopped, because I remembered there was nobody else working that night. There was no other ranger in the park. It was just me. And the voice on the radio was calling, as if from a ranger who was already out there, in the dark, on the one path we never walked. The voice came again, clearer this time, and it said my name. Not ranger station. My name. First name. I pulled my hand back like the radio had burned me. My heart was going so hard I could feel it in my throat. And the voice kept talking, patient, calm, almost kind. I know you're there. I can see your light on. It gets cold out here at night. I've been out here a long time. Won't you come and help me find the way back? I didn't answer. I sat there in the dark, both hands pressed flat against the desk, and I didn't make a sound, because I understood in that moment exactly what was happening. It wasn't a lost hiker. It wasn't another ranger. It was him. And he'd found a new way in. He couldn't cross the meadow. So he was reaching through the one thing I couldn't ignore. The one thing my whole job was built around. The call for help. The voice went on for almost an hour. I know because I watched the clock the whole time, not moving, barely breathing. It told me things. It said it knew my uncle, the one who used to work forestry, which shouldn't have been possible because my uncle never worked this park. It said my uncle was up there too on the path waiting for me, cold and alone, and wouldn't I be a good nephew and come bring him home? That one nearly broke me. I'm not ashamed to admit my eyes filled up, because for one terrible second I wanted it to be true. I wanted to believe my uncle was out there, and I could see him again. But I knew better. My uncle died in a hospital bed with my whole family around him. He was never anywhere near Hollow Pine. And that's how I understood, finally and completely, what this thing really was. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't the lost ranger, not really. It was something older than that, something that wore the ranger like a costume. The same way it would wear my uncle, the same way it would wear anything it needed to get you to walk up that path on your own 2 feet. It couldn't take you. You had to go to it. That was the rule. That was the whole game. Just before the voice finally went silent that night, it said one last thing. It stopped pretending to be a hiker, stopped pretending to be my uncle. And it spoke in a voice that was flat and dry and ancient, a voice with no warmth in it at all. It said, "You counted me once. You know you did. That means you already started walking. You just haven't taken the last steps yet." And then the radio went dead. Not static. Dead. Completely silent in a way a radio never really goes. I called Russ at home that night, even though it was past 2 in the morning. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been waiting for the call, like he'd known it was coming. I told him everything. The voice, my uncle. The last thing it said. There was a long pause on the line. And then Russ said something that made the floor drop out from under me. He said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to tell you the truth now, the whole truth, because you're past the point where a lie will keep you safe." Then he told me why he'd really warned me on my very first week, and it wasn't to protect me. "I warned you about the North Path on your first week," Russ said, and his voice on the phone was heavier than I'd ever heard it, because that's the rule. That's how it works. The ranger who comes before has to warn the one who comes after. It has to be said out loud, has to be passed down, or the whole thing breaks. And if it breaks, It doesn't go away. It just picks somebody at random, somebody who never got the warning, and it goes for them hard and fast, with nothing to slow it down. I asked him what he meant by that. What did passing the warning have to do with anything? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing I've never been able to shake, because I counted him too, 30 years ago. Same as you. I was young and I didn't know, and I wrote him in my log, and from that night on I was on the path, same as everybody who came before me. It moves slow. It can take years, decades even. But once you start walking, you don't stop, and there's only one way to buy yourself time. I already knew what he was going to say. I felt it before the words came. You pass it on, Russ said. You train a new ranger. You give them the warning so the rules are satisfied and the thing has someone fresh to work on. And while it's working on them, it eases off you. It has to divide its attention. That's the only mercy in the whole rotten arrangement. That's how I've lasted 30 years, kid. Every time it got close to me, the service sent me a new trainee, and I passed the warning, and the clock reset. I sat there in the dark with the phone against my ear, and I understood what he was telling me. He'd known. From the day I arrived, he'd known exactly what he was doing. The warning wasn't a kindness, it was a handoff. I wasn't his student. I was his replacement on the path. I asked him, and I could barely get the words out, whether he'd known this would happen to me, whether he'd brought me in on purpose to take his place. The silence on the line lasted a long time. I didn't pick you, he said finally. The service assigned you. But I knew what it meant when they did. And I won't lie to you. I was relieved. God help me, I was relieved because I'm old and I'm tired. And I've been walking that path in my sleep for 30 years. And I wanted it to stop. I told myself you were young and strong, and maybe you'd figure out something I never could. But the truth is, I passed it to you the second I said the words, and I've been able to sleep at night ever since, for the first time in longer than I can remember. I wanted to be angry at him, I really did. But sitting there in the dark, I couldn't manage it because I understood him too well. If I lasted long enough at Hollow Pine, if a new trainee showed up green and clueless the way I had, I already knew in the coldest part of me that I would do exactly what Russ did. I'd warn them, and I'd feel relieved. That was the real horror of it. Not the man in the meadow, not the voice on the radio. The thing at Hollow Pine wasn't just hunting rangers. It had turned us into its own trap. Every warning that was supposed to save us was actually feeding the next person in. We were the bait and the hunter both, passing the curse hand to hand, generation to generation, all of us telling ourselves we were the good guys, all of us secretly grateful when a fresh face walked through the door. But then Russ said something that changed everything. And it's the reason I'm telling you all this instead of just running. There's one more thing, he said, quieter now, almost a whisper, like he was afraid of being overheard. Something I've never told another living soul. Something I figured out about 10 years ago and never had the courage to test. Because testing it meant giving up the only thing keeping me alive. I asked him what it was. It counts on you passing it forward, he said. That's the whole engine of it. It survives because every ranger is too scared to break the chain. But that means the chain can be broken. If somebody refuses to pass the warning, if somebody just tells the truth out loud to somebody who was never a ranger and never will be, somebody outside the whole thing entirely, it doesn't know what to do with that. The rules never accounted for it. You'd be dragging it out into the open, where it can't hide behind a uniform and a logbook. I asked what would happen if I did that. Russ said, I don't know. That's the honest answer. Maybe it dies. Maybe it starves, with nobody left inside the chain to feed on. Or maybe it comes for you all at once, the way it does when nobody got the warning, and you don't last the week. He paused. But I know this much. If you break the chain, you're the last one it can touch. There's nobody after you to hand it to. So it's all or nothing. You either end it, or it ends you, and there's no more passing the buck. And that was when I understood why I'm sitting here right now, recording this, telling all of you every single detail. Because you're not rangers. You never were, and you never will be. You're strangers on the other side of a screen, listening to a story, and every one of you that hears this is one more person standing outside the chain that thing built. I'm not passing you the warning. I want to be very clear about that. This isn't a warning. There's no path here for you to walk, no logbook for you to write in, no meadow with a man standing in it. You can't inherit this. That's the whole point. I'm doing the one thing that was never supposed to happen. I'm telling the truth, out loud, to people it can't touch. But there's a reason I haven't finished the story yet. There's a reason I'm still whispering, still glancing at the window while I talk to you. Because 3 nights ago, after I decided to do this, after I made up my mind to break the chain and tell all of you everything, something changed at Hollow Pine. The man stopped standing at the tree line. He started getting closer to the station. And last night, for the first time, I heard footsteps on the porch. I need you to understand something before I tell you how these last 3 nights have gone. When I decided to break the chain, I wasn't brave about it. I want to kill that idea right now because I've watched enough of these stories to know people always paint themselves as the hero at the end. I wasn't a hero. I was a man who'd run out of other options, sitting alone in a ranger station with a thing outside that had finally stopped playing by the slow, patient rules it had followed for 100 years. The moment I decided to tell all of you, it knew. I don't know how. Maybe it can feel the chain going taut when someone tries to snap it. But that same night, the man in the meadow was no longer in the meadow. When I looked out the north window at dusk, he was standing in the parking lot, maybe 40 feet from the door, closer than he'd ever been. And for the first time, I could see his face. I'm not going to describe it in detail because some part of me is still protecting you, even now. I'll just say it wasn't the face of the lost ranger from the old story. It wasn't anyone's face, really. It was more like a face that had been assembled out of every ranger who'd ever walked that path. All of them layered on top of each other, none of them fitting quite right. And when I looked at it, I recognized my uncle in there. And I recognized Russ. And God help me. Near the front of all those faces, faint but unmistakable, still forming, still settling into place, I recognized myself. That's when I called Russ again. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I tried 6 times over the next hour. Nothing. And around midnight, my radio came alive one last time, and it wasn't the flat, dry, ancient voice anymore. It was Russ, clear as day, his real voice exhausted and afraid. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm on the path. It came for me the second you decided to break the chain. There's nobody after you, so it can't reach forward anymore. All it's got left is backward. It's collecting everybody, whoever passed it on. Everybody's still alive, and it's pulling us all up the north path at once. I can see the others ahead of me. Rangers I trained 40 years ago. We're all walking. I can't stop my feet." I begged him to fight it, to turn around, to do anything. And he just gave a tired little laugh, the saddest sound I've ever heard. And he said, "It's all right, kid. This is what I get. I fed it for 30 years to save my own skin. But you did the thing none of us ever had the guts to do. You broke it. Don't waste it. Don't you dare pass it on to save yourself. End it. Let all of us go. Then the radio went dead. And this time, I knew it wasn't coming back. The last 3 nights, the footsteps on the porch have gotten heavier and more frequent. It circles the station now. I hear it out there in the dark, moving around the walls, testing the windows, never quite coming in. Because it still can't come in. That rule holds even now. It cannot take me. I have to go to it. And I am not going to go. Last night was the worst of it. Around 3 in the morning, it started using their voices. All of them. My uncle, telling me he was cold. Russ, begging me to come find him because he was lost and scared and it was so dark up on the path. Voices of people I'd never met, rangers dead for decades, all of them just outside the door, all of them asking me so gently, so reasonably, to open it and step outside and help them find their way home. I didn't open the door. I sat in the middle of the room with my back to the wall and my hands over my ears, and I waited for the sun. And when the light finally came, the voices stopped, and the footsteps stopped. And there was nothing on the porch but a scatter of pine needles and one set of muddy boot prints that walked right up to my door and then simply ended, as if whoever made them had lifted off the earth. So here's where things actually stand. And here's why I've told you all of this. It's starving. I can feel it, the same way you can feel a storm coming before the clouds show up. It's got no chain left to feed on. Russ and the others were the last of what it had stored up, and it's spending them fast, using them like a man burning his own furniture to stay warm one more night. When they're gone, there's only me. And I'm not going up that path. I'm going to sit right here, outside the chain I refuse to extend, and I'm going to wait it out. Maybe it dies. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe in a week the footsteps stop for good and I finally get to leave Hollow Pine and never look back. Or maybe one of these nights I'll get tired, or weak, or lonely enough that a familiar voice on the other side of the door will finally sound like reason instead of a trap, and I'll reach for the handle. I honestly don't know which way it goes, but I know this. Whatever happens to me, it ends with me. There's no next ranger. I made sure of that the moment I started talking to you. You can share this, you can pass it around, you can tell it to 100,000 people, and not one of you can catch it. Because none of you ever counted him. None of you ever wrote him in a log. None of you ever stood in that meadow and lifted your hand to wave. You're safe. That was the whole point. That was the only thing I had left to give. If the footsteps come back tonight, I won't be recording. I'll be sitting in the dark with my back to the wall, same as always, listening to the voices of dead men ask me to come home, and reminding myself that the door stays shut. If you don't hear from me again, you'll know how it ended. And if you ever take a job somewhere quiet, somewhere small, somewhere that isn't on any postcard, and an older coworker pulls you aside on your first week to warn you about a place you should never go, do me one favor, don't thank them. Just turn around, walk out, and never count anything you can't explain. Story 2. People always ask me what the scariest part of being a park ranger is. They expect me to say bears or getting lost or falling off something high. And I get it. Those are the things that make sense to be scared of. But the honest answer, the one I don't usually give at parties, is that the scariest part is the lost and found box. Let me explain, because I know that sounds like a weird thing to be afraid of. I spent about 9 years working at a fairly popular state park, the kind with a big lake, a campground, a visitor center, with a gift shop, the whole deal. Families came through by the thousands every summer. And when you have that many people coming and going, they leave things behind. sunglasses, water bottles, phone chargers, kids' toys, single shoes. You would not believe how many single shoes we found. All of it went into a big plastic bin behind the front desk at the visitor center. And every few months, whatever nobody claimed got donated or thrown out. My name is Ryan, and for most of those 9 years, the lost and found bin was just a chore. Log the item, hold it for 90 days, get rid of it. Boring. The kind of thing you do without thinking. Then, in my 7th year, we got a new item in the bin that changed how I felt about that box forever. And honestly, changed how I feel about a lot of things. It was a camera. One of those older digital ones. The kind with the little screen on the back from before everybody just used their phones for everything. A camper found it half buried in the dirt near one of the more remote backcountry sites, out past where most families bother to go, and turned it in at the front desk. Standard stuff. My coworker logged it, tossed it in the bin, and that would normally be the end of it until the 90 days ran out. But it was a slow afternoon, and I was curious, and I figured maybe if I looked at the photos on it, I could figure out who it belonged to and save myself the paperwork. People do that sometimes. Take a selfie or a shot of their license plate, and you can track them down and mail their stuff back. So I turned it on. The battery still had a little life in it, and I started going through the pictures. The first few were exactly what you'd expect. A young couple, maybe late 20s, smiling at the camera with the lake behind them, setting up a tent, cooking over a little camp stove, normal vacation stuff. They looked happy. The guy had one of those big, friendly grins, and the woman kept making silly faces. I remember thinking they seemed like nice people, the kind you'd want as neighbors. I kept scrolling. More camp photos, a hike, a shot of a deer they'd gotten close to. The pictures were time-stamped, which was helpful, and I could see they'd been on a 3-day trip, going deeper into the backcountry each day. The photos told the story of their trip in order, like a little flip book. And then, around the start of what would have been their 3rd day, the photos started to change. Nothing dramatic at first. Just the feeling of them changed. The smiles got a little thinner. In one shot, the woman was looking off to the side of the frame, instead of at the camera, and her face had this expression I couldn't quite name. Not scared, exactly. More like she was concentrating on something, listening for something. The guy was still smiling in most of them, but even his grin started looking forced. The way you smile for a photo when you're not really in the mood, but your partner insists. I told myself I was reading too much into it. People get tired on long trips. 3rd day of hiking, you're sore. You're not sleeping great on the ground. Of course you look a little worn out. That's all it was. Then I got to a photo that made me stop scrolling and sit up straight in my chair. It was a picture of their campsite, taken from a little distance away, like one of them had walked off to photograph the whole scene. The tent, the fire pit, their gear. And standing at the edge of the trees, at the very back of the shot, mostly hidden in shadow, there was a person. Not the guy, not the woman. A 3rd person, just standing there at the tree line watching the camp. I zoomed in as much as the little screen would let me. It was hard to make out. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see a face, but there was no question it was a person. And there was no question they were watching. I checked the timestamp. Late afternoon, 3rd day. And I thought, okay, another camper wandered into frame. No big deal. The backcountry isn't totally empty, but something about the way that figure was positioned right at the edge, half hidden, not part of the scene but observing it, put a knot in my stomach that I couldn't quite untie. I almost put the camera down right then. I wish I had. But there were more photos after that one. A lot more, and I needed to know how the story ended. The next several photos were normal again, or normal enough that I let myself relax a little. More shots around the campfire, the two of them eating dinner, the sky going orange as the sun went down. Whoever that figure at the tree line was, they didn't show up in these. I told myself again that it had just been a passing hiker, someone cutting through, and the couple probably never even noticed them in the background. People don't examine their own vacation photos as carefully as a bored ranger does on a slow afternoon. But then the timestamps jumped. There was a gap. The dinner photos were from early evening, and the next picture was from the middle of the night, something like 2 in the morning. And this one was different. It was dark, obviously, taken with the flash on. And it was a photo of the inside of their tent. Just the two of them lying in their sleeping bags. The woman was asleep, or her eyes were closed anyway, but the guy was awake, and he was looking right at the camera, and his face had completely changed from the friendly grin at the start of the trip. He looked frightened, genuinely, deeply frightened. The way you look when something's very wrong and you don't know what to do about it. Now here's the part that got under my skin. Somebody had to be holding the camera to take that photo. And both of them were in the shot in their sleeping bags on the far side of the tent. So whose hand was on the camera? I stared at that picture for a long time. I came up with explanations. Maybe they had a little tripod. Maybe the camera had a timer and it went off by accident. Maybe he'd set it up to take a photo for some reason I couldn't guess. All of those were possible. None of them explained the look on his face, or why anyone would be taking flash photos inside their own tent at 2 in the morning while their partner slept. I kept going. The next photo was worse. Same night, a few minutes later, by the timestamp. This one was taken from outside the tent, looking in through the mesh at the 2 sleeping bags. From outside. Somebody was standing outside their tent in the middle of the night, taking a picture of them sleeping with their own camera. The knot in my stomach pulled tight. Because now the story the photos were telling wasn't a vacation anymore. Somebody had taken this couple's camera while they slept, or while one of them was awake and too afraid to move, and that somebody was photographing them, documenting them, like a hunter taking pictures of game. I want to be honest about my state of mind here. Part of me was scared, sure. But a bigger part of me was telling myself this had to be some kind of prank, or a staged art project, or those 2 goofballs from the first photos messing around trying to scare themselves. People do dumb stuff on camping trips. I'd seen it 100 times, so I kept scrolling, half convinced the next picture would be the 2 of them laughing, revealing the whole thing was a joke. It wasn't. The next photo was of the woman alone, in daylight now, the 4th morning. She was sitting on the ground with her back against a tree, and her hands were tied in front of her with what looked like the cord from their tent. She was crying. You could see it clearly, her face red and wet, her mouth open like she was saying something or begging, and she was looking up at whoever held the camera with an expression I have never been able to forget. Pure terror, but also this awful pleading, like she was asking a question, and already knew the answer was no. The guy wasn't in the photo. I set the camera down on the desk, and I just breathed for a minute. My hands weren't totally steady, because whatever this was, joke or not, I was looking at a picture of a woman who was tied up and crying in the backcountry of the park I was responsible for. and the timestamp said it had happened. This wasn't a story someone made up. This was a record of something that occurred out there on the trails I walked every day. I looked at the date on the timestamp more carefully, and that's when the second knot formed, because I recognized it. The trip in these photos had happened almost 2 years earlier. 2 years. Which meant whatever happened to these two people, it was long over by now. And I had never heard a single thing about a couple going missing in our park. No search, no news story, no flyers, nothing. In 9 years, I knew about every incident we'd ever had. And a young couple vanishing on a backcountry trip would have been the biggest thing to ever happen here. I would have remembered it. Everyone would have. But there was no record. It was like it never happened. Except I was holding the camera that said it did. There were more photos. I could see the little counter in the corner. Maybe 15 or 20 left. And every instinct I had said to turn the camera off, put it in an evidence bag, and call the county sheriff right that minute. But I didn't. Because the next photo, the one waiting on the screen when I picked the camera back up, wasn't of the couple at all. It was a photo of the visitor center. Our visitor center. The one I was sitting inside of. Taken from the parking lot looking at the front doors, and the timestamp on it was from that morning. I need to walk you through my thinking here, because I know how this sounds. A photo of my own visitor center, timestamped that same morning, on a camera that had supposedly been buried in the dirt in the backcountry for who knows how long. It didn't make sense. Cameras don't take pictures by themselves. Somebody had to be standing in our parking lot that morning, pointing this exact camera at our front doors, and then that camera ends up in my hands hours later. My first thought, the reasonable one, was that the timestamp was just wrong. Old cameras lose their settings when the battery dies. The clock resets, gives you garbage dates. That happens all the time. So maybe that photo of the visitor center was actually from 2 years ago, too, back when the couple was still alive and taking normal vacation pictures, and the clock had just glitched. Except the visitor center, in the photo, had our new sign. We'd only put that sign up 4 months earlier. The old one had been wooden and faded, and the county finally replaced it with a big metal one. So that picture could not have been taken 2 years ago. It was recent. It was, if the timestamp was telling the truth, from that very morning. Which meant the person who took these photos, the person who tied up that woman and photographed her crying in the woods, had been standing in our parking lot a few hours before that camper turned in the camera. I got up and walked to the front windows and looked out at the parking lot. It was a normal afternoon, families loading coolers into their cars, kids running around, a couple of RVs parked in the far lot. Nothing wrong, nothing out of place, but I stood there looking at the exact spot where that photo had been taken, and I felt like I was being watched, which is a stupid feeling to have in a parking lot full of families in broad daylight, but I felt it anyway. Deep in my gut, the way you feel it when someone's eyes are on the back of your neck. I went back to the desk. I made myself keep going through the photos because at this point I wasn't just curious anymore. I was scared, and being scared made me need to understand. The next few pictures were all of the park, but not the pretty parts, not the lake or the overlooks. They were pictures of the working parts of the park. The parts visitors don't usually photograph. The maintenance shed, the back office, the employee parking area, the little trail that staff used to get from the parking lot to the ranger station without going through the public areas. Somebody had been photographing where the staff worked, where we came and went, our routines. And then there was a photo that stopped my heart, because it was a picture of me, taken from a distance through a window without my knowing. I was sitting at the front desk, at that exact desk in my uniform, doing paperwork. I recognized the shirt I was wearing. It was the shirt I had on right then, at that moment, as I looked at the photo. The picture had been taken earlier that same day, through the front window of the visitor center, while I sat there working, completely unaware that anyone was pointing a camera at me. I put the camera down again and I looked at the front window, and there was nobody there. Of course, there was nobody there. But somebody had been, hours ago, close enough to photograph me through the glass, and I hadn't noticed a thing. Here's where I made a decision that I've gone back and forth on ever since. I should have called the sheriff. Any sane person would have called the sheriff. But I didn't, and I'll tell you why. It was because of the next photo, and the reason I even scrolled to it instead of stopping was that I noticed there was only one left. Just one more picture on the camera. And I had to see it. So I scrolled to the last photo. It was a picture of the lost and found bin. Our bin, behind the front desk, the big plastic one. And sitting on top of the pile of sunglasses and water bottles and single shoes was the camera. This camera. The one I was holding. Somebody had taken a picture of the camera sitting in our lost and found bin. But that was impossible. And I mean genuinely, physically impossible, not just creepy. Because for that photo to exist, someone would have had to take a picture of the camera with the same camera. You cannot photograph an object using that same object. It's like trying to see the back of your own head without a mirror. It cannot be done. And yet there it was. The last photo on the camera was a clear, well-lit picture of that exact camera, sitting in our bin from earlier that day. I sat there holding it, and the reasonable explanations I'd been feeding myself all afternoon finally ran out. There was no glitchy clock explanation for this, no prank explanation, no passing hiker, no art project, no goofing around. Somebody, or something, had been in our visitor center that day, had photographed the camera in the bin using the camera in the bin, and had left it for me to find. The whole trip in those photos, the happy couple, the figure at the tree line, the tied-up woman, the pictures of me through the window. It wasn't a record of something that had happened 2 years ago and ended. It was still happening. And somehow it had circled all the way around me. I finally reached for the phone to call the sheriff. And as I picked it up, my coworker Dave came in from the back, saw the camera in my hand, and his face went white. He said, "Where did you get that?" I told Dave a camper had turned it in that morning, found it out past the backcountry sites, and that I'd been going through the photos. And Dave just stood there in the doorway with this look on his face like I'd told him I found a body. He came over, slow, and he picked up the camera off the desk, real careful, like it might go off, and he looked at the little screen, at that impossible last photo of the camera in our own bin. Then he asked me a question that didn't make any sense at the time. He asked, "How many photos did you look at?" I told him all of them, start to finish, the whole trip. Dave closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, he pulled a chair over and sat down across from me, and he said, "Okay, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not think I'm crazy, because I've got maybe an hour to explain this, and then it's going to be too late for both of us. Here's what Dave told me, and I'm giving it to you the way he gave it to me, because I've had a long time to check it against what happened, and every word of it turned out to be true. The camera wasn't new to the park. It came back." That was the phrase he used. It came back. According to Dave, that same camera, or one exactly like it, had turned up in our lost and found 3 separate times over the years he'd worked there, and probably more times before that, going back longer than anyone could say. Every time, some camper would find it out in the backcountry and turn it in. Every time, it had the same photos on it. The happy couple, the trip, the figure at the tree line, the woman tied up, and every time, the last several photos were different because the last several photos were always of the person who found it. The current park, the current staff, the current ranger who made the mistake of looking through it. I asked him what happened to the people in the earlier photos, the other rangers. Dave was quiet for a second. Then he said there'd been a ranger named Paul, years back, before my time, who'd gone through the whole camera the same way I just had. And about a week later, Paul went out on a routine patrol into the backcountry and never came back. They searched for a month, never found him. And the camera disappeared from the lost and found around the same time, like it left with him. He said there'd been another one before Paul, a seasonal employee, a young woman whose name he didn't even know from way back. Same thing. Looked through the camera, went into the backcountry a week or so later, gone. No trace. The pattern, Dave said, was always the same. The camera shows up. Somebody looks through all the photos, the whole story, right to that last impossible picture. And once you've seen the whole thing, once you've reached the end, you've got about a week. Then the backcountry calls you out, one way or another, and you don't come back, and your last days end up on the camera for the next person to find. I asked him the obvious thing. I asked how he knew all this if everyone who looked at the camera disappeared. And Dave said, because I looked at it too. 6 years ago, I got to the picture of the tied-up woman, and something in my gut told me to stop, and I put it down, and I never scrolled to the end. I never saw the last photos. I never saw myself. And I'm still here. He leaned forward. That's the rule, Ryan. That's the only rule that matters. If you don't finish it, it doesn't finish you. The ones who stop partway through, they're fine. It only takes the ones who see the whole thing, the ones who reach the end. And that's when the floor dropped out from under me, because I'd seen the end. I'd scrolled all the way to that last impossible photo of the camera in the bin. I'd finished it, every single frame. Dave saw it on my face. He didn't have to ask. He just sort of deflated, sat back in the chair, and said very quietly, "How far did you get?" I told him. "The last photo. The camera in the bin." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Okay. Then we've got about a week to figure this out because I'm not losing another one. Not this time. Now here's where I have to tell you about the twist. The thing that turned this from a scary story into the worst week of my life. Because it's the part Dave didn't know, the part none of the rangers before us had ever figured out. And I only understood it because of a detail Dave let slip without realizing what he'd said. He told me the camera had come back 3 times that he knew of. The couple. The same photos every time. And I asked him, just to be sure, whether the couple in the early photos was always the same couple. The happy young pair from the start of the trip. And Dave said yes, always the same two. The guy with the big grin and the woman making silly faces. But I'd looked at those photos more closely than Dave ever had. I'd zoomed in on every face on that little screen for the better part of an hour. And the woman in those early vacation photos, the happy one making faces before everything went wrong, I recognized her. It had been bothering me the whole time, and I hadn't been able to place it. But when Dave said it was always the same couple, it clicked. The woman in the photos was the seasonal employee. the young woman Dave mentioned. The one from way back who'd looked at the camera and vanished into the backcountry. I'd seen her before, in an old staff photo hanging in the back hallway of the visitor center. A faded picture of the park employees from decades ago. Her face was in it, younger but unmistakable. The couple in the vacation photos weren't visitors at all. They were the two rangers before us, the ones the camera had already taken. It hadn't just recorded them. It had put them in the trip. It had made them the happy couple at the start of the next loop. So the next ranger who looked would think they were watching strangers, when really they were watching the people the camera had already swallowed, smiling and setting up their tent at the beginning of a trip that always ended the same way. Which meant I finally understood what those last photos of me really were. They weren't warnings. They were the beginning of the next trip. And in the next loop, whenever the camera came back, some future ranger was going to scroll through it on a slow afternoon and see a happy young guy in a ranger uniform, smiling at the desk, setting up for a trip he didn't know he was on. That guy was going to be me. I have to tell you how that week went, because the way it actually happened is not the way I braced myself for. And the difference is the whole reason I'm still here to record this. Dave and I made a plan. Or Dave made a plan and I went along with it because I was too rattled to think straight. His idea was simple. The camera called people into the backcountry. Every ranger it had taken had gone out on patrol and vanished in the wild parts of the park. So the solution, Dave figured, was that I just wouldn't go. For 1 week, I would not set foot past the visitor center. I'd work the front desk, I'd stay in populated areas, I'd have someone with me at all times, and I would not, under any circumstances, walk into the backcountry. If the trap needed me to come out to it, then I simply wouldn't come. It was a good plan. It made sense. And it was completely wrong, but we didn't know that yet. The first few days, nothing happened. I stayed inside. Dave stuck close. We told our supervisor some story about me having a bad ankle, so I'd be kept on desk duty. The camera sat in a locked drawer in the back office because neither of us wanted it in the bin anymore, and neither of us was willing to be the one to destroy it in case destroying it made things worse. And every day that passed without incident, I let myself hope a little more that we'd beaten it, that keeping me out of the woods was enough. But here's the thing I started to notice around the 4th day. I wasn't sleeping. And when I did sleep, I had the same dream, over and over. I dreamed I was setting up a tent at a backcountry site. The same one from the photos, and I was happy in the dream, laughing, and there was someone with me just out of sight. And I kept turning to look at them, and the dream would end before I could see their face. I'd wake up with dirt under my fingernails. Actual dirt. Even though I hadn't left the visitor center. Even though I'd showered before bed. There was always a little dirt under my nails in the morning, like I'd been digging. I didn't tell Dave. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it real. But I think, looking back, that dirt was the trap working on me from the inside, drawing me out a little more each night, and I was too scared to admit it was already happening. On the 6th day, the camper came back. The same camper who'd turned in the camera. He walked into the visitor center, and he came up to the desk, and he asked, real friendly, whether anyone had claimed that camera he'd found, because he'd been thinking about it, and he wanted to make sure the owners got it back. Nice guy. Genuinely trying to do the right thing. And I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, because when he'd originally turned in the camera, I'd barely glanced up. And I recognized his face. He was the man from the very first photo. The happy guy with the big grin, the one I'd assumed was a vacationer at the start of the trip. It was him, standing at my desk, asking about his own camera. I must have gone pale, because he tilted his head and asked if I was okay. And I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady, when exactly he'd found the camera. What day? He said he found it that morning, just a few hours ago, out past the backcountry sites. But he'd turned it in almost a week earlier. I had the log entry. I'd written it myself. I'd spent the last 6 days terrified because of the photos on a camera this man had handed me 6 days ago. And he was standing here telling me, completely sincere, that he'd found it that morning for the first time and was turning it in. That was when I finally understood the real shape of the thing. The part Dave never figured out. The part that made all our planning useless. The camera wasn't calling me out into the woods. It never had. The rangers before us didn't vanish because they walked into the backcountry. They walked into the backcountry because they'd already vanished. The disappearance came first. The trap didn't take you at the end of the week. It took you the moment you finished looking at those photos. And then it let you live out one final week as a kind of echo. A person who didn't know they were already gone, going through the motion, sleeping and waking and making plans, while the world quietly rearranged itself to loop you back to the beginning. The camper finding the cameras again that morning wasn't a mistake. It was the loop closing. From his side of it, the week I just lived through hadn't happened yet. He was at the start, and I was at the end. I turned to look for Dave, to tell him, to warn him. And Dave wasn't there. His chair was empty. His jacket was gone. I asked the other staff where he was, and one of them looked at me confused and said, Dave had left on a backcountry patrol that morning and wasn't due back until evening. But Dave never did backcountry patrols. He hadn't gone into the deep woods in years. Not since he'd looked at that camera 6 years ago and made his rule. He knew better. He would never have gone out there. Unless it finally called him to. Unless 6 years was just how long his echo lasted. And looking at the camera again this week, holding it, getting pulled back into the whole thing, had started his clock over and run it out all at once. They never found Dave. The search lasted 3 weeks. And about a month after he disappeared, a family camping in the backcountry turned in a camera they'd found half buried near one of the remote sites. An older digital one with a little screen on the back. My new co-worker logged it and put it in the bin, and on a slow afternoon, out of boredom, started scrolling through the photos to find the owner. I stopped her before she got far. I took the camera out of her hands, and I told her the rule Dave should have understood better than anyone. You can look at a few. You can be curious, but you do not scroll to the end. You never finish it. She thought I was strange, but she listened. I'm telling all of you this now because I've done the math on my own week, and it doesn't add up the way it should. That happy camper, the man from the first photo, the one who came back to ask about his camera, I've realized I never actually saw him leave the visitor center that day. He asked about the camera, and I turned to look for Dave, and when I turned back, he was gone. Just gone. And these last 2 years, I've noticed the dirt again, under my fingernails, every few mornings. Even though I never go into the backcountry anymore, even though I moved states and left that park behind, and took a desk job in a city 300 miles from any forest, I keep having the dream about the tent. And in the last few dreams, the person setting it up beside me finally turned around, and I saw their face. It was mine. so I don't know how long an echo lasts. Dave got 6 years. Maybe I get more, maybe I get less. But if this recording ever cuts off in the middle, or if the last thing on it is a photo none of you can explain, I want you to know I saw it coming. And I want you to do the one thing that keeps you out of the loop. If a camera ever ends up in your hands, out in some park, some quiet place, full of a stranger's happy vacation photos, look at a few if you have to. But whatever you do, don't reach the end. Story 3. The radio call that changed everything came at 4:17 in the morning, and it was a voice I knew asking for help that hadn't been requested. I remember the exact time because I wrote it in my log, the way I wrote down everything, and that log is one of the few pieces of proof I have that any of this really happened. My name is Kevin, and back then I was a ranger at a mountain park in the western part of the country. The kind of place with high peaks and deep valleys, and stretches of wilderness so remote that if you got hurt out there, help could be a full day away, if it came at all. I worked the night shift a lot, which most rangers hate, but I liked. The park was mine at night. Quiet, still, just me and the radio and the occasional call about a raccoon in a cooler or a camper who'd had too much to drink. Night shift was boring, and in that job, boring is good. Boring means nobody's dying. So when the radio came alive at 4:17 that morning, I was half asleep in my chair at the ranger station, and it took me a second to shake myself awake and grab it. The voice on the other end was a ranger named Marcus. Marcus worked the same park I did, a good guy, solid, been there longer than me, and he was calling for backup. He said he was up at a trailhead near the north face, that he'd found an abandoned vehicle and signs of a possible injured hiker, and he needed a second ranger to come help him search. He gave me the location, clear as anything, and asked me to head up right away. Now I want to explain why my stomach turned cold the moment I heard his voice, because it wasn't the request itself. Backup calls happened. The reason my blood ran cold was that Marcus was off that week. He told me himself 3 days earlier that he was driving down to the coast to visit his sister and wouldn't be back until the following Monday. He was supposed to be 400 miles away, sitting on a beach. I keyed the radio and I asked him, careful, whether he wasn't supposed to be at his sister's. There was a pause, just a beat too long. And then Marcus laughed, that same easy laugh I'd heard 100 times, and he said plans changed, that his sister had to cancel, that he'd picked up a shift instead, and here he was, which was a perfectly reasonable explanation. People's plans change all the time, but something about that pause stuck with me, and something about the laugh. It was Marcus's laugh, exactly, and yet it landed wrong, the way a song sounds wrong when it's played back just slightly too slow. I told him I was on my way, because what else was I going to do? A fellow ranger was calling for help with a possible injured hiker. That's the whole job. You go. You don't sit at the station second, guessing a man's laugh while somebody might be bleeding out on a mountain. I grabbed my kit, got in the truck, and started up the service road toward the north face. It was maybe a 40-minute drive, most of it on rough, unpaved switchbacks that hugged the side of the mountain. The kind of road you take slow even in daylight, and this was pitch dark, that deep mountain dark where your headlights feel like they're the only light in the entire world. About halfway up, I tried to raise Marcus on the radio again, just to check in, let him know my progress. He answered right away. But this time, when I asked how the injured hiker was doing, whether he'd made contact, he said something that didn't fit. He said he was still waiting on me at the trailhead and hadn't started searching yet, because protocol said to wait for backup, which would have been fine, except 2 minutes earlier, in his first call, he told me he'd already found signs of the hiker and needed help searching. Now he was saying he hadn't started. Small thing, Easy to explain. Maybe I misheard the first time. Maybe he meant he'd seen signs but hadn't begun the actual search. I told myself all of that. But I slowed the truck down anyway without really deciding to. Some part of me, some older, deeper part that doesn't use words, had started tapping the brakes before my brain caught up to why. I kept climbing toward the north face, toward Marcus, toward the trailhead. And the whole way up, I had the strangest feeling that I was driving towards something that was wearing my friend's voice like a coat it had found and put on because it fit. The trailhead near the north face was a small gravel lot carved into the side of the mountain, just big enough for maybe 6 or 7 cars with a wooden information board at one end and a trail sign pointing up toward the peak. When my headlights swept across it, I saw 2 vehicles. One was a Ranger truck, same model as mine, parked neat at the edge of the lot. The other was a beat-up sedan sitting crooked near the trailhead, driver's door hanging open, dome light glowing a weak yellow inside. The abandoned vehicle, presumably. The one Marcus had called about. But I didn't see Marcus. I parked, left my engine running and my headlights on, and I got out. It was cold up there, that thin, high mountain cold that gets into your lungs, and it was silent in the way only high places are silent, where even the wind seems to be holding still. I called out for Marcus. My voice went out into the dark and came back with nothing. I keyed my radio and asked where he was, and his voice came right back, calm, close. He said he was just up the trail a little ways, that he'd started up to look for the hiker, and I should come meet him, follow the trail. He wasn't far. I looked at the Ranger truck parked in the lot. Marcus's truck. The engine was off, the hood cold when I touched it, like it had been sitting there for hours. And I thought if he only just started up the trail, why is his truck stone cold? I want to be honest about my mindset here, because I think it matters. At this point, I was scared. But I was also a professional with years on the job, and professionals talk themselves out of fear constantly. It's practically the job description. So I told myself the truck was cold because it was a cold night, and cold nights cool an engine fast. I told myself Marcus's slightly off answers were just radio confusion, the kind that happens all the time on those mountain frequencies. I told myself the open door on the sedan and the possible injured hiker were the real emergency, and my job was to focus on that and stop spooking myself. But I did one thing that probably saved my life. Before I started up that trail, I walked over to the sedan and looked inside. It was empty. No blood, no sign of a struggle, nothing dramatic. Just an ordinary car. But there was a purse on the passenger seat, and next to it, a park map, and a paper coffee cup in the holder, and the little details of a normal person's normal day. I looked at the registration in the door pocket. The car belonged to a woman, and the coffee cup, when I touched it, was still faintly warm. Warm coffee. Up here in the cold at 4 a.m. That meant whoever owned this car had been here recently. Very recently. Not hours ago. Minutes, maybe. And here's the thing that made me step back from that car with my heart starting to pound. Marcus's first radio call, the one that woke me at 4:17, said he'd found an abandoned vehicle and signs of a hiker in trouble. But if the coffee was still warm, the vehicle hadn't been abandoned when he called. The owner had still been here, or close, when Marcus first radioed me. So either Marcus had lied about it being abandoned, or the call I got at 4:17 came from someone who was watching this woman arrive, watching her get out of her car, and describing the scene to me while it happened, calling it abandoned, because he already knew it was about to be. I backed away from the sedan toward my truck, and I keyed my radio, and I asked Marcus a question. I asked him what color shirt he was wearing. A dumb question on its face. But Marcus and I had a thing we did, a habit from years of working together, where we'd describe what we were wearing over the radio when we couldn't see each other in the dark, so we wouldn't mistake each other for a stranger and startle. It was our little routine. If this was really Marcus, he'd know exactly why I was asking, and he'd answer without missing a beat, and probably rib me for it. There was a pause on the radio, longer this time. Then the voice said, warm and easy, "Same shirt I always wear, buddy. Come on up, you're burning moonlight." And that was wrong. That was so wrong that I felt it in my teeth, because Marcus would have said the color. That was the whole point of the routine. He'd have said green or gray, and then made fun of me for asking. He wouldn't have dodged it with a friendly non-answer. The thing on the other end of that radio knew Marcus's voice, knew his laugh, knew his easy manner, but it didn't know our routine. It didn't know the answer, so it talked around it, smooth and confident, hoping I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I got back in my truck, quietly. I didn't slam the door. I pulled it shut soft. And I sat there with the engine running and the heater going, staring up at the black trail where the voice wanted me to go, and I made myself think. The radio came alive again. Marcus's voice, still friendly, but with something new underneath it now. A thread of impatience. He asked where I was. Said he could see my headlights down in the lot, so he knew I'd arrived, and asked why I wasn't coming up. He could see my headlights, which meant he could see me, which meant he was up there somewhere on that dark slope, looking down at my truck, watching me sit in it and not come. I turned my headlights off, and in the sudden dark, before I could second guess it, I put the truck in reverse and started backing out of that lot, slow and careful on the gravel, no lights, just the faint gray of the sky to steer by. The radio said my name, not backup, not ranger, my name, Kevin. And then it said, in Marcus's voice, but flat now, all the warmth gone out of it, "Where are you going? You just got here." I backed down that mountain road in the dark, for as long as I dared, which wasn't long, because those switchbacks would kill you in daylight, never mind blind. After maybe a quarter mile, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I turned my headlights back on, swung the truck around in a spot barely wide enough to do it, and drove down the normal way, facing forward, going as fast as the road would let me. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the mirror. Nothing behind me. Just the dark and the dust my tires kicked up. The radio stayed quiet for a while. Then, when I was maybe 2 miles down from the trailhead, it started again. And this is the part that I've never been able to fully explain to anyone. The part that makes people look at me sideways when I tell it. The voice on the radio changed. It was still Marcus at first, calling my name, asking me to come back, telling me the hiker needed help, that I was abandoning a woman in trouble, that this wasn't like me, that he was disappointed in me, playing every card it could to turn me around. And when that didn't work, when I didn't answer and didn't turn around, the voice shifted, mid-sentence. Marcus's voice sort of slid sideways into a different voice, a woman's voice, frightened and crying, saying she was hurt. She was up by the north face. She needed a ranger. Please, please come back. She could see my lights leaving, and she was begging me not to go. The woman from the sedan, or something using her voice the way it had used Marcus's. And then that voice slid again into a child's voice, a little kid crying for help, lost and cold and calling for anyone to come find them. And then another voice, and another. It cycled through them, one after another, all of them scared, all of them pleading, all of them coming out of my radio in the pitch dark on a mountain road at 4:30 in the morning. It was running through everyone it had, is what it felt like. everyone it had ever taken, trying each voice like a key in a lock, looking for the one that would make me turn the truck around. I turned the radio off. Not down. Off, all the way. And I want you to understand how hard that was, because turning off your radio in the backcountry is a thing rangers just do not do. That radio is your lifeline. It's the difference between living and dying out there. Turning it off felt like cutting my own rope. But I could not listen to those voices anymore, and some instinct told me that as long as I kept answering, kept listening, kept engaging with it at all, I was giving it a way to reach me. So I killed the radio, and I drove the rest of the way down in total silence, just the engine and my own breathing and the gravel under the tires. I got back to the main ranger station right around 5. The sky was just starting to go gray at the edges. I went inside, locked the door behind me, which I had never once done in all my years of night shifts, and I sat down at the desk, and I tried to think about what to do. The reasonable move was to call this in. Get the sheriff, get the daytime rangers, get a real search team up to that trailhead at first light. There was a woman's car up there with warm coffee in it. That was real. Whatever was happening with the voices, there was a genuine missing person, and she needed help that I was equipped to organize. So I picked up the station's landline, the actual phone, not the radio, and I called our dispatch, the county line that connected us to the sheriff and to the other rangers. And a woman answered, our regular overnight dispatcher, a person I'd talked to 1,000 times, and I started explaining, fast, about the trailhead and the abandoned car and Marcus, and she stopped me. She said, Kevin, Marcus is right here. I didn't understand. I asked what she meant. She said Marcus had come into the county dispatch office about 20 minutes earlier, that he'd driven back from the coast early, decided to check in before heading home, and he was standing right there in the office getting a cup of coffee. She said, hang on, and I heard her call his name, heard footsteps, and then Marcus's voice came on the line, the real one. I knew it was real because the first thing he said was, Kevin, why do you sound like that? What's wrong? And then before I could answer, he said, and why is it green, in case you're about to ask? It's always green. The shirt. The routine. He gave me the answer without even being asked, ribbing me for a question I hadn't gotten to ask yet, because that's what the real Marcus would do. That's how I knew, beyond any doubt, that the man on the phone was actually him, and that the thing on the radio up at the North Face had never been Marcus at all. I told him everything, as fast as I could. The 417 call, the trailhead, the cold truck that looked exactly like his, the voices. And Marcus went quiet. And then he said something that made the hair stand up all over my body. He said, Kevin, I never called you. My radio's been off since I left town 4 days ago. And that truck you saw up there? All our trucks are accounted for at the station. I'm looking at the lot right now. Every single one is here. There's no ranger truck up at that trailhead. There can't be. But I'd seen it. I'd touched the hood. Cold metal. Real as anything. A ranger truck. Our model. Parked neat in that lot next to the woman's sedan. And that's when I finally understood what I'd almost walked into. It hadn't just been imitating Marcus's voice. It had built a whole scene to pull me in. A truck that looked like ours, parked to make me think a ranger was already there. A real abandoned car. A real missing woman. To make the emergency feel true. And a voice that knew my friend well enough to fool me. All of it arranged like a stage set on the side of that mountain, waiting for me to park my truck and walk up that dark trail toward the one thing in the whole scene that was actually real and actually waiting. Marcus said he was getting the sheriff and a team together right now, that they'd meet me and go up to that trailhead together at first light in force, in daylight. He told me to sit tight at the station and not go anywhere. I agreed. I hung up the phone. And in the quiet after, I heard something that told me sitting tight at the station was not going to be enough. The radio I'd turned off, all the way off, the one with no power running to it at all, made a small sound of static. And then Marcus's voice, soft and patient, said, "You told them, and that's all right. I know where you are now." I stared at that radio for a long time. It was off. I'd turned it off with my own hand in the truck, and it had stayed off the whole drive down. And it was off now, sitting there on the desk with its little power light dark. Radios don't talk when they have no power. That's not a scary story thing. That's just electricity. A dead radio is a dead radio. And yet I'd heard it, clear as day, in Marcus's voice, telling me it knew where I was. I unplugged it from the wall just to be sure, pulled the power cord clean out, and I picked up the handheld radio I carried on my belt, the battery-powered one, and I turned that off too, and I took the battery out of it, and I set both of them on the far side of the room, as far from me as the station would allow. Then I sat back down at the desk, and I waited for daylight and for Marcus and the sheriff, and I tried to keep myself together. Here's the thing about waiting alone in a ranger station in the dark when you know something's out there and it knows where you are. Your mind turns on you. Every ordinary sound in that little building became a threat. The building settling, the refrigerator in the break room, the wind against the windows. I knew rationally that these were just the sounds an empty building makes at some night, the same sounds I'd ignored for years. But now every one of them made me flinch, because I couldn't stop imagining that thing coming down off the mountain, wearing whatever face it needed to wear, walking down the service road toward the little lit window where I sat. And that's when I noticed the window. The ranger station had big windows across the front, looking out at the parking lot and the road beyond. During the day, you could see the whole valley. At night, with the interior lights on, all you could see was your own reflection and the black glass. I'd been sitting with my back to those windows the whole time, facing the door, because the door felt like the threat. But some prickle on the back of my neck made me turn around and look at the glass. And in the reflection, in the lit-up interior of the station, reflected back at me in the dark window, I could see the room behind me, the desk, the chairs, the far wall where I'd set the radios. And standing near the door to the back hallway, in the reflection, was a park ranger. I spun around in my chair. The room was empty. Nobody by the hallway door. Nobody anywhere. Just me. I turned back to the window, slow, and the ranger was still there in the reflection, standing by the hallway door, in uniform, same as mine. But where the face should have been, in the reflection, there was just a kind of smeared blankness, like a photograph of a person with the face rubbed out. It didn't move. It just stood there in the reflected room, in a spot where the real room was empty. I understood then that it hadn't needed to come down the mountain at all. It didn't travel the way people travel. It had been reaching me through the radio, through Marcus's voice, through every voice it tried, and now it had found a new surface to stand in. The dark glass, the reflection. It was in the window, in the mirror version of my station, standing in a room that looked exactly like mine, except it had a visitor. I did the only thing I could think of. I got up and I turned off the interior lights. With the lights off, the reflection vanished. You can't have a reflection in a window without light behind it. The room went dark. The window went from a black mirror to just plain darkness. with the faint gray dawn beyond it, and the ranger with no face was gone, because there was no longer a reflected room for it to stand in. I stood in the dark, breathing hard, and I thought maybe I'd figured out a rule. It needed a way in, a radio, a reflection. Some surface or channel it could use. Take those away, and it couldn't reach you. I held on to that idea like a life raft, and I sat in the dark and I waited. And slowly, the sky outside got lighter, gray, then pale, then touched with the first real color of morning. And with the daylight came the sound I'd been praying for. The sound of engines on the service road, several of them, headlights swinging into the lot. Marcus and the sheriff and a whole team, right on time, at first light, exactly like they'd promised. I have never in my life been so relieved to see other human beings. I went to the door and unlocked it, and stepped out into the cold morning air, and there was Marcus climbing out of the lead truck, and 2 sheriff's deputies, and a couple of the day shift rangers, all of them geared up and serious, ready to head to the North Face and search for the missing woman. Marcus came up to me and put a hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I told him no, not really, but that I would be. He said they'd take it from here, that I'd been up all night and been through something nobody would believe, and that I should go home and sleep. He said they'd handle the search. And I almost did. I almost got in my truck and drove home, and let them go up that mountain without me. But I looked at the group of them, all standing there in the gray morning light, and I did a head count, the way you do, the way it's drilled into you. Marcus, 2 deputies, 2 day rangers, 5 people who'd driven up in 3 vehicles. I counted the shadows on the ground, stretched long by the low morning sun. There were 6. I stood there in the parking lot counting shadows and coming up with one more. Then there were people, and I want to describe exactly what that was like, because it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quietest kind of terror there is. 5 men standing in the morning light, and 6 long shadows stretched across the gravel. And a one-up, those shadows didn't have a person standing at the top of it. It just lay there on the ground, the shape of a person, attached to nothing. I didn't say anything at first. I just counted again, slower, making sure. Marcus, 2 deputies, 2 day rangers, 5, 6 shadows. And the extra one, I noticed, was pointing the wrong way. All the real shadows fell to the west, away from the rising sun, the way shadows are supposed to. The extra one fell to the east, toward the sun, like it belonged to a light source that wasn't there, or to a person standing where no person stood. Marcus was talking, telling me again to go home and get some rest. And I looked up from the shadows, and I looked at the faces of the men in front of me, and every one of them was a face I knew. Marcus and the 2 deputies I'd met before, and the 2 day rangers I worked with every week. All real, all familiars, all accounted for. So I asked the question that had been building in me since 4:17 that morning. I asked out loud to the whole group, who's standing behind me? Because that extra shadow, the one pointing east, was stretched out from a spot right behind where I stood. And every one of the 5 men looked at me and then looked past me at the empty gravel behind my shoulder, and I watched their faces change. I watched Marcus's easy expression fall away. I watched one of the deputies take a step back and put his hand on his belt. They were looking at something behind me, something I couldn't see because it was behind me and it cast no reflection and it made no sound, but they could see it. 5 men in broad daylight, all staring at the same empty patch of air right behind my shoulder, and all of them going pale at once. I didn't turn around. I want to be clear about that. Everything I'd learned that night told me not to turn around, not to look at it, not to give it my attention or my acknowledgement, because looking was how it got in. Through the radio when I listened, through the window when I looked. It needed you to turn toward it. So I didn't. I stood dead still, facing my friends, and I said, very calmly, "Don't any of you look at it directly. Get in the trucks. We're leaving, right now." And to their enormous credit, they did. Nobody argued. Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the lead truck, keeping his eyes down. And the deputies and the day rangers scrambled into their vehicles. And we all got in and shut the doors, and Marcus threw the truck in reverse and got us out of that lot fast, gravel spraying, and not one of us looked back at whatever had been standing behind me in the morning sun. We never went up to the North Face that day. We called in the state police and a full search and rescue team, and they went up in a big group in the middle of the day, and they found the woman's sedan exactly where I'd said it would be. Empty. Warm coffee, long gone cold. They searched that whole mountain for a week and never found her. She was never found. Her family got the same nothing that every family gets in these stories, and I have carried the fact that I drove away from that trailhead, that I turned my truck around instead of going up to look for her, every single day since. But here's the twist, the part that took me years to understand, the part that I've only recently made my peace with. I went back through the records after all of it settled down. The old logs, the incident reports, the histories of that trailhead near the North Face, and I found something. That trailhead had a pattern. Every few years, going back decades, a hiker would go missing there, and every single time, without exception, a second person would go missing too. A searcher, a ranger, or a volunteer, or family member who went up looking for the first one. The trap always took two. The lost hiker was the bait. The searcher was the meal. It didn't want the woman in the sedan, not really. She was just the warm coffee, the lure, the thing that would make a good ranger drive up a mountain at 4 a.m. to help. The one it actually wanted was the one who came to help. The one it wanted was me, and I realized that the 417 call, the voice wearing Marcus, the whole stage scene with the fake truck, it wasn't trying to hurt the woman. She was already taken. It was trying to get me to complete the pair. That's why it worked so hard. That's why it cycled through all those voices, why it followed me down the mountain, why it reached through a dead radio and stood in my window and finally came all the way to my station and stood behind me in the light. It had its first. It just needed its second. It needed me to turn around one time and look at it and acknowledge it and become the searcher who never comes back. I never turned around. That's the whole reason I'm still here. Not because I was brave, because I was too scared to look. And being too scared to look turned out to be the only thing that saved me. I left that job about a year later. I couldn't work nights anymore. I couldn't stand the radio, couldn't stand dark windows, couldn't stand the sound of a friend's voice coming out of a speaker when I couldn't see their face. I moved on. I do something else now. Something indoors, something with no mountains and no trailheads and no service roads that climb up into the dark. But I still count shadows. It's a habit now, one I can't break. Every time I'm in a group, out in the sun, I count the people, and I count the shadows, and I make sure the numbers match. Most of the time they do, almost all of the time. There have been 3 occasions in all the years since where they didn't. 3 times, in a crowd, in the daylight, I've counted one more shadow than there were people. And all 3 times, I felt that same old prickle on the back of my neck. That sense of something standing just behind my shoulder, patient, waiting for me to do the one thing I've promised myself I will never do again. So if you're ever out somewhere bright and open, and you get a cold feeling on the back of your neck, and some quiet part of you is sure that someone is standing right behind you, do yourself a favor. Count the shadows first, and whatever the number tells you, do not turn around. Let me start with a fact that took me a long time to accept. Some places don't want to be mapped. I know how that sounds. I work with maps for a living, or I used to. 6 years as a backcountry ranger at a wilderness area up in the northern part of the state, and if you'd told me back then that a stretch of forest could have opinions about being measured, I'd have laughed and offered you coffee. My whole job was measurement. Trail distances, elevation changes, water levels, campsite counts. I trusted numbers the way some people trust religion. Numbers don't lie to you. Numbers don't get scared. That's what I thought. My name is Dale, and I'm 41 now, which means the thing I'm about to tell you happened almost 15 years ago, back when I was still young enough to think I understood the world. The wilderness area I patrolled was huge, something like 90,000 acres, and only 4 of us to cover the whole thing. We each took a section, and mine was the western quarter, which was the most remote and the least visited. Weeks would go by without me seeing another human being who wasn't a co-worker on the radio. I liked it that way. I'm not a people person. That's part of why the job suited me. Just me, the trees, my gear, and a whole lot of quiet. Now, every section had its quirks. The eastern quarter had a river that flooded every spring and washed out the same bridge no matter how many times we rebuilt it. The southern quarter had a cave system that hikers were always getting lost in. My western quarter had something the old rangers called the blank. The blank was a valley, not a big one, maybe a mile across, tucked between 2 ridges in the deepest part of my section. And the reason they called it the blank was simple. It wouldn't hold data. Compasses spun in there. GPS units lost their signal and never got it back until you climbed out. Every attempt anyone had ever made to survey it properly had failed, because the measurements never matched. You'd walk the same route twice and get 2 different distances. You'd photograph the same rock formation from the same spot on 2 different days, and the photos wouldn't line up. The official explanation was mineral deposits, some kind of iron-rich rock underground that messed with instruments. That's what the paperwork said, and I believed the paperwork because believing the paperwork was easier than the alternative. The blank had one rule, passed down from ranger to ranger for as long as anyone could remember. You could hike through it. You could even camp on its edges if you had to. But you never, ever spent the night at its center. Not because anything bad had ever officially happened there. Just because it was tradition. The kind of rule nobody questions, because questioning it feels like bad luck. I kept that rule for 4 years without ever thinking about it. And then, in my 5th year, a research team showed up with permits from the regional office, and everything I thought I knew about my own section of forest started to come apart. There were 3 of them: a geologist named Karen, a grad student named Tyler, and their equipment guy, a quiet, older man named Gary, who I never heard say more than 10 words at a stretch. They'd come to study the magnetic anomaly in the blank. Real scientists, real funding, real permits I couldn't argue with. My job was to escort them in, keep them safe, and get them out again. Simple. Karen was sharp and friendly, and clearly the leader. On our first night at the trailhead, over the camp stove, she asked me what I knew about the valley. I gave her the mineral deposit explanation, the same one I'd always believed. She nodded along, but there was something in the way she looked at me, a kind of careful patience, that made me feel like she knew something I didn't. Then she said, Iron deposits don't do what this place does. We've looked at the readings from the last survey attempt. Whatever's down there, it isn't in the rock. I asked her what she meant. She just smiled, poked at the fire, and said, "That's what we're here to find out. That's the whole reason they sent us instead of a normal survey crew." I didn't think much of it at the time. Scientists like to sound mysterious. But I remember that Gary, the quiet one, looked up from his gear when she said it, and he looked at me across the fire with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear, exactly. More like sympathy. Like he felt sorry for me and didn't want to say why. We hiked in the next morning, and the moment we descended into the blank, my compass started to spin, slow and lazy, like it was looking for something it couldn't find. I'd seen it do that 100 times. But this time, for reasons I still can't explain, watching that little needle turn made the back of my neck go cold, and some quiet voice in the back of my head that I'd never listened to before said, very clearly, "Turn these people around and go home." I didn't listen. I wish I had. The valley floor was strange in a way that took me a while to put into words. It was too even, and that's the best I can describe it. In a normal forest, the ground rolls and dips. Roots break the surface. Rocks jut up where they please. But the floor of the blank was smooth and flat, like something had come through a long time ago and pressed it down. The trees grew straight and evenly spaced, almost like an orchard, except no one had ever planted them, and it was silent. Not the good kind of forest silence where you can still hear the small stuff, birds and wind and bugs. This was a total silence, the kind that makes your own heartbeat sound loud. Karen noticed it too. She stopped about 20 minutes in, held up her hand, and asked the group to just listen for a second. We all stood there. Nothing. No bird song, no insects. Tyler, the grad student, said something like, "That's not normal, right? Even the anomaly shouldn't scare off the wildlife," and Karen just wrote something in her notebook without answering. Gary set up the first round of equipment near the center of the valley. Magnetometers, seismic sensors, a couple of things I didn't recognize. And this is where it got interesting, in the way that a slow leak in a boat is interesting. The instruments couldn't agree with each other. Two magnetometers sitting 3 feet apart gave readings that were wildly different. Gary moved them, recalibrated them, swapped them, and it didn't matter. The numbers refused to settle. Karen loved it. To her, this was a puzzle, and she was thrilled to be inside it. She kept saying things like, "There's a structure to this, we just have to find it." And she had the team lay out a grid across the valley floor with little flags so they could take readings at fixed points. I helped them plant the flags. Boring work, but it kept my hands busy, and honestly, I was glad for the distraction, because that voice in the back of my head hadn't gone quiet. It had gotten worse. By late afternoon, they had their grid finished. 100 little orange flags in a perfect 10 by 10 square across the middle of the blank. Karen sent Tyler to walk the grid and take a reading at every flag, one by one, calling out numbers while Gary logged them. And that's when the first genuinely wrong thing happened. Tyler counted 103 flags. We'd planted 100, 10 by 10. I'd counted them myself as I placed them, because that's the kind of person I am. 100, exactly. But when Tyler walked the grid, he came back and said there were 103. Karen laughed and told him to recount, figured he'd double back on a row. He walked it again. This time he counted 98. Karen stopped laughing. She walked the grid herself, slow and careful, touching each flag as she passed it. She came back pale. She'd counted 101. Then she asked me to do it, since I was the one who planted them, and I'd know if any were mine and any weren't. I walked that grid 3 times. I got 100, then 104, then 99. Same flags, same square, same me. Different numbers every time. Now, I want to be fair here. There are boring explanations for a lot of this. It's easy to lose count. Flags can lean and hide behind each other. Your eyes play tricks in flat, repetitive terrain. I told myself all of that out loud to the group in my most reassuring ranger voice, and they wanted to believe me, I could tell. But there was one detail that none of us could explain away, and it's the detail that started to change the mood from scientific curiosity to something quieter and colder. Some of the flags were the wrong color. We'd brought orange flags. Only orange. I unpacked them myself, but scattered through the grid now, maybe 6 or 7 of them, were flags of a faded, dirty white. Old ones. Weathered like they'd been out in the sun and rain for years. Karen picked one up and turned it over in her hands, and on the little white flag, in handwriting none of us recognized, was a number. Just a number, written in old, faded ink. It said 14. She checked another white flag. That one said 9. Another said 22. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Tyler asked the question we were all thinking, which was, 14 what? 9 what? And Gary, the quiet one, who had barely spoken the entire trip, said in a flat voice without looking up from his equipment, people. It's counting people. Karen asked him what he meant by that. How he could possibly know that. Gary finally looked up, and he looked older than he had that morning somehow, like the valley had added 10 years to his face. He said, because I've been here before. 20 years ago. Different job, different crew. We planted flags too. And by the end, the flags were counting us. And there were more numbers than there were people, because it had already started keeping the ones who didn't make it out. He paused, and then he said the thing that made my stomach drop. I'm the only one who came back. And I swore I never would. But when the regional office offered me this contract, they didn't tell me where it was until we were already on the trail. By then, it was too late to say no. I asked him why he hadn't warned us, why he'd let us walk in. And Gary said very quietly, because it doesn't let you warn people. Watch. Try to tell them right now, plainly, that we all need to leave. Try to say the words. I opened my mouth to do exactly that. To turn to Karen and Tyler and say we're leaving. Right now, pack up, we're going. And I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. My throat closed up like I'd forgotten how to speak. I could talk about anything else. I could describe the weather, the trail, my own name. But the moment I tried to form the specific idea of leaving, of escape, of getting these people out, my voice simply stopped working, and a pressure built behind my eyes like the beginning of the worst headache of my life. I looked at Gary. He nodded slowly like he'd known exactly what would happen. It doesn't want us to go, he said. Not yet. It's still counting. The sun started going down, and that changed everything, because now we had a decision to make that none of us wanted to make. The rule I'd lived by for 4 years, the one every ranger before me had passed down, was simple. You don't spend the night at the center of the blank. And here we were, 4 people standing in the exact center, as the light drained out of the sky, unable to say the words that would get us moving. I tried a different approach. If I couldn't say we should leave, maybe I could just do it. Actions instead of words. I started packing up my own gear, slow and casual, figuring I'd get the others to follow by example. And that worked for about a minute. Tyler saw me and started rolling up his sleeping pad. Karen began collecting her notebooks. For a moment, I thought we'd found the loophole. Then Tyler stopped, holding his half-rolled pad, and got a confused look on his face. He said, "Wait, Why am I packing? We're not done with the readings. And he unrolled it again and sat back down. I watched it happen in real time. The intention just leaked out of him, like water through a cracked cup. Karen did the same thing 30 seconds later. She looked down at the notebooks in her hands, frowned, and set them back out as if she'd never meant to move them at all. It was working on me, too. I'd get my pack halfway loaded, and then find myself standing there wondering what I'd been doing, and I'd set the gear back down and feel strangely calm about it. Like everything was fine, like there was no reason to hurry. The valley was making us forget. Not all at once. Just enough. Just the one specific thought that would save us, plucked out of our heads over and over the second it formed. Gary was the only one it didn't seem to affect the same way. And I asked him why. He said it was because he'd been here before. That once you've survived it, some part of you stays awake to it forever, and it can't put you back to sleep as easily. But he also said that didn't help him much, because being awake to it just meant he got to watch it happen with his eyes open. We ended up building a fire as it got dark, because there was nothing else to do and the cold was coming on fast. And around that fire, Gary finally told us the whole story of what had happened 20 years before. I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to us, because it matters for what came after. His old crew had been 5 people. They came to survey the valley, same as us, and they ran into the same problems. Instruments that wouldn't agree. Counts that wouldn't hold. And on their second night, against the rule, they'd camped in the center because a storm rolled in and it was the only sheltered spot. That night, one of them walked off into the dark and didn't come back. They searched the next day and found nothing. No body, no tracks, nothing. But that evening, when they counted their remaining gear, there were still 5 sleeping bags laid out. 5, even though there were only 4 of them left. The next night, another one walked off. Same thing, gone without a trace, and still 5 sleeping bags. Then 4 people became 3, and there were still 5 sleeping bags. And by then, the survivors understood that the valley wasn't losing count of them. It was keeping the full number. It refused to let the total go down. Every person it took, it replaced with the memory of a person, held in place by an empty sleeping bag that no one would admit to noticing. Gary was the last one standing. He said he only made it out because on the final night, he stopped trying to leave. He stopped fighting it. He sat by the fire and did nothing at all, made no plans, formed no intentions, just emptied his head and waited. And somehow, at dawn, he found his feet carrying him up out of the valley on their own, like the thing had lost interest in a man who'd stopped struggling against the hook. That's the trick, he told us, staring into the fire. It feeds on the trying. Every time you plan to escape and it stops you, it takes a little piece. The counting isn't really about numbers. The numbers are just how it shows you the score. What it's actually counting is how many times each of us has tried to run and failed. And when your number gets high enough, when you've been worn down enough times, that's when you get up in the night and walk off into the dark and become one more empty sleeping bag. Tyler asked the obvious question. He asked how high the number could go before it took you. And Gary looked across the fire at the little white, weathered flags still stuck in the grid behind us, the ones with the old faded numbers on them, and he said, "The highest one out there right now says 22. That was the last member of my old crew, the one who lasted the longest before I made it out. He tried to leave 22 times." He was quiet for a moment. "I found a new white flag while you were building the fire. It's stuck at the edge of the grid. It wasn't there this afternoon." Karen asked what number was on it. Gary didn't answer right away. Then he said, 3. And every one of us understood, without him having to explain, that the valley had started a new count. That the flag with the 3 on it wasn't from 20 years ago. It was from today. It was one of us. We just didn't know which. I did the math in my own head, quietly, counting the times I'd tried to pack my bag and been made to forget. I'd tried 3 times. Exactly 3. I didn't tell the others. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to, because the second I tried to form the words, my throat closed up all over again. Nobody slept that first night, which was fine because sleeping was the last thing any of us wanted to do. Gary had made that much clear. The valley took people when they drifted off or when they got up in the dark, half awake, and wandered. So we kept the fire high, and we kept our eyes open, and we talked. About anything, about nothing, just to keep each other anchored to the waking world. Karen told us about her kids. Tyler talked about a road trip he'd taken across the country the summer before. I told them about the time I'd rescued a hiker who'd gotten himself stuck on a ledge and cussed me out the whole way down. Small human things. It helped. For a while. But somewhere in the deepest part of the night, I noticed something that I kept to myself, because I didn't want to be the one to say it. There were 4 of us around the fire. Me, Karen, Tyler, Gary. But every so often, out of the corner of my eye, in the flickering edge of the firelight, it looked like there were 5. A 5th shape, sitting just past Gary, in the dark space between the light and the trees. When I turned to look straight at it, there was nothing there. Just an empty patch of ground, and the black wall of the forest beyond. But when I looked back at the fire and let my eyes relax, the 5th shape came back, sitting quietly with the rest of us, listening to our stories. I told myself it was exhaustion. Your eyes do things at night when you're tired and scared. But then I caught Tyler looking at the same spot, and then quickly looking away, and I knew he was seeing it too. And neither of us said a word about it because saying it out loud felt like an invitation. Dawn came finally, gray and slow, and with the light, the 5th shape was simply gone, and the pressure in the valley eased just enough that we could breathe. Gary said the daytime was safer. Not safe, but safer. The counting slowed down when the sun was up. That gave us a window, and Karen, to her enormous credit, used it. She was a scientist to the bone, and even terrified, even exhausted, she was still trying to understand the thing that had us. She spent the whole morning studying the grid, the flags, the readings, and around midday she called us over because she thought she'd found something. She'd been comparing the numbers on the old white flags with their positions in the grid, and she'd noticed a pattern. The flags with the highest numbers, the 22s and the 19s, were all clustered near the exact center of the valley. The lower numbers, the ones just starting their count, were out toward the edges. It was like a spiral. The longer the valley worked on you, the closer to the center it drew you, until finally you reached the middle, and you were gone. It's not random, she said, and there was a spark of hope in her voice that I hadn't heard since we'd walked in. It has a shape, and anything with a shape has a way out. We just have to move against the spiral, outward, away from the center, not trying to leave, not planning to escape, just physically moving in the one direction it doesn't want us to go, a little at a time, so it doesn't notice the intention behind it. And it was the first real plan any of us had come up with, and it made a strange kind of sense. If we couldn't hold the thought of escape in our heads, then we wouldn't try to. We'd just walk outward. No plan, no destination in our minds, just one foot placed a little further from the center than the last. We wouldn't let ourselves think about the trailhead or home or freedom. We'd only think about the next step and the next. drifting outward as casually as we could manage, hoping the thing that fed on our trying wouldn't recognize a plan that never let itself become one. So that afternoon, we started to drift. We'd move our little camp 50 feet toward the western ridge, then sit and rest and talk about nothing, then move it another 50 feet, always outward, always casual. And it worked. That was the terrifying, exhilarating part. It actually seemed to work. By evening, we'd moved almost a quarter mile from the center, and the pressure behind my eyes had lifted, and the silence didn't feel quite so total anymore. Once, I even heard a bird, a single bird, somewhere up on the ridge. I nearly cried at the sound of it. We made camp that second night much closer to the western edge, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I let myself believe we might actually get out. Gary allowed himself a small smile. Karen was practically glowing with the satisfaction of having cracked the puzzle. Tyler fell asleep finally, and we let him, because we were close enough to the edge now that Gary thought the risk was lower. And that's when I found the flag. I got up to gather more wood, and at the base of a tree just past our new camp, stuck in the dirt where it had no business being, was a fresh white flag. Not weathered, not old, bright white, brand new, planted that very day. And on it, in that same faded old handwriting that shouldn't have been possible on a brand new flag, was a number. It said 4. I stared at it for a long time, because I understood something then that undid the entire plan, that undid the little bird and Karen's spiral and the hope I'd let myself feel. We hadn't been moving toward the edge. We'd been moving exactly where it wanted us to go the whole time. The spiral Karen found was real, but she'd read it backward. The center wasn't where it took you. The center was where it kept the ones it had already finished with, the high numbers, the trophies. The edge, the western ridge, the way out, that was where it did its actual work. That was the mouth of the thing, and we'd spent all day walking cheerfully into it, congratulating ourselves the entire way. And the number on the flag was 4, my number, because I'd tried to leave 3 times that first day, and gathering this firewood, drifting toward this edge, believing I was escaping, was the 4th try. It had counted my hope as one more attempt. Karen's whole clever plan had just been the valley's smartest way yet of getting us to keep trying. I turned to run back to the fire, to wake the others, to tell them we'd gotten it exactly wrong. And behind me, from the direction of our camp, I heard Gary's voice call out, calm and quiet in the dark. "Dale, don't come back. Whatever you see, keep walking away." I didn't keep walking. I couldn't. Everything in me pulled back toward that fire, toward the 3 people I was supposed to protect, and I ran back to camp as fast as the dark would let me. Gary had told me not to. I want that on the record. He warned me, and I ignored him, and the same way I'd ignored that quiet voice on the first day. I've had 15 years to think about whether that made me brave or just stupid, and I still don't have an answer. When I got back to the fire, Tyler was standing up. He'd been dead asleep 2 minutes before, and now he was on his feet, facing the western ridge, the direction we'd been drifting all day. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing anything. He had that slack, peaceful look on his face, the one Gary had described, the one people get right before they walk off into the dark and don't come back. And Karen was reaching for his arm, saying his name, trying to pull him back, and Gary was shouting at her to let go, to not touch him. Because touching someone the valley had called was how it got 2 for the price of 1. Karen didn't let go. Of course she didn't. She had kids at home and a good heart, and she wasn't the kind of person who could watch a 24-year-old grad student walk into the dark and just let it happen. She grabbed his arm with both hands and dug her heels in, and I finally understood what the numbers really counted. Not how many times you tried to leave. That was close, but it wasn't the whole truth. What the valley counted was how much you had left to lose. Every time you tried to run, you weren't just failing. You were showing it how badly you wanted to live, how much you cared, and that wanting was the thing it fed on. That was why Gary, who'd given up hope 20 years ago and stopped trying, who kept his head empty and his heart flat, was the one it left alone. It had already drained him dry the first time. There was nothing left in him to take. And it was why Karen, full of love and hope and a plan she believed in, had the highest hunger on her the entire trip. She just never saw her own flag. Gary told me later he'd hidden it. Hers said 9. She pulled Tyler back from the edge. She actually did it. For one shining second, she yanked him off his feet and away from the ridge, and I thought, we made it. She saved him. We're going to be okay. Then she went still. Her hands were still gripping Tyler's arm, but her own face had gone slack now, peaceful, empty. Tyler blinked, suddenly awake, confused, alive, and Karen turned toward the western ridge with that same faraway look, and she let go of him, and she started walking into the dark. We went after her, Gary and Tyler and me. We got maybe 30 feet before the trees seemed to fold around her, the way a crowd closes up after someone passes through, and she was just gone. No sound, no scream. 1 second she was ahead of us in the dark, and the next, the space where she'd been was empty forest, and no matter which direction we ran, we couldn't find a single trace of her. Not a footprint, not a dropped notebook, nothing. Gary grabbed both of us and said the only thing that saved our lives. He said, stop looking for her. Stop wanting her back. If you keep wanting, it'll take you too. You have to let her go. Completely. Right now. In your heart. And I want you to understand how monstrous that was, what he was asking. To stand in the dark and force yourself to stop caring about a woman who'd just been dragged off. To hollow out your own heart on purpose so the thing wouldn't smell your grief. But we did it. God help me, we did it. Tyler and I sat down in the dirt, and we made ourselves go blank. Made ourselves feel nothing. Thought about nothing. Wanted nothing. While Gary talked us through it in a low, steady voice like a man landing a plane. And at dawn, empty and numb and hating ourselves, the three of us walked up out of the western ridge and out of the blank, our feet carrying us the way Gary's had carried him 20 years before, because we'd finally stopped giving it anything to hold on to. We reported Karen as lost in a fall. It was the only story that made sense on paper, the only thing the words would let me write. The official search found nothing, which surprised no one, given the terrain. Her family got a memorial and no answers. I've carried that lie for 15 years, and it's the heaviest thing I own. Here's the plot twist, though, and it's the reason I finally decided to tell this story out loud instead of taking it to my grave. About a month ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, an old survey photo of the blank from decades back, a wide shot of the whole valley floor. And in the margin, in faded old handwriting I recognized instantly, was a note. It said, "You never really left. You just stopped counting. Come finish the survey. We saved you a flag." I called Gary the day I got it. His number was disconnected. I drove out to the address I had for him, and a young family answered the door and told me the old man who'd lived there had walked off into the woods behind the house 8 months ago and never come back. They'd never found him. So I don't know what to tell you. I got out of that valley, or I thought I did, I emptied my heart and I let Karen go and I walked out into the sunlight, and I've spent 15 years believing the flat, numb thing I did to survive was temporary. But you don't get to feel nothing on purpose and then just switch caring back on when it's convenient. I've been half empty ever since. Ask my ex-wife. Ask the friends I stopped calling. Maybe that's the real count. Maybe the valley never had to take the rest of me all at once. Maybe it's been drawing me back to the center, slow, one hollow year at a time, and the flag with my number on it has just been sitting out there in the grass this whole time, patiently going up. If you ever take a job in the backcountry, and the old rangers tell you there's one valley you don't camp in, don't ask them why. Don't get curious. Curiosity is just wanting wearing a nicer coat. And out there, wanting is the only thing that can kill you. I'm not going back to finish the survey. I want to be clear about that in case this is the last thing anyone ever hears from me. Whatever walks off into the woods behind my house one of these nights, whatever they don't find when they search, it won't be me choosing to go. It'll just be the count finally reaching the number it started writing on a little white flag 15 years ago while I stood there in the dark and told myself I was getting away.